The moment Professor Thane announced practical combat demonstrations, I knew today was going to be interesting. Across the training hall, Zarak-Tel was already smirking at me with that insufferable expression that made my fingers itch for violence. The 7-foot-tall Krathian warrior had been looking for an excuse to humiliate a human since I'd arrived at the Galactic Military Institute 3 months ago. Looks like he was finally going to get his chance. Or so he thought. Lieutenant Maya Torres. Professor Thane called out, his tentacles writhing with what might have been anticipation or concern. Please demonstrate Earth's close-quarters combat methodology. I stepped onto the training mat wearing standard academy fatigues that did absolutely nothing to hide how physically outmatched I was compared to most species here. At 5'6" and 130 pounds, I looked like a strong breeze could knock me over. The other cadets probably thought the professor was joking by asking me to demonstrate anything combat-related. They were about to learn why that assumption was a mistake. Earth techniques, Zarak-Tel announced loudly enough for the entire class to hear, are primitive flailing compared to Krathian war forms that have been perfected over 10,000 years. Several students laughed. Even Professor Thane's expression suggested he was reconsidering his demonstration choice. Only Lyra, my Zen3 roommate, looked worried rather than amused. She'd seen me training at Dark 30 when I thought no one was watching. She knew what was coming. Care to demonstrate the superiority of those war forms? I asked Zarak-Tel directly, keeping my voice pleasant and my stance relaxed. Practical comparison beats theoretical discussion every time. His yellow eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. It would be my honor to provide educational context for inferior techniques. Educational context. That was diplomatic language for public humiliation. Professor Thane looked between us with clear hesitation, probably calculating whether letting a Krathian warrior spar with a human student violated some kind of safety protocol. Lieutenant Torres, he said carefully, perhaps we should begin with a demonstration against training drones rather than live opponents. With respect, Professor, my combat effectiveness is best illustrated against thinking opponents who can adapt and respond. I turned to face Zarak-Tel fully, giving him my best smile. Unless the Krathian warrior forms are too delicate for practical application, that got him. Pride was a universal constant among warrior cultures, and questioning a Krathian's courage was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Zarak-Tel stepped onto mat with movements that showcased his species' natural advantages. Enhanced strength, reinforced bone structure, and reach that gave him nearly 2 feet of advantage over my comparatively tiny human frame. Standard sparring rules, Professor Thane announced, though his tone suggested he was already composing the incident report. First of 3 confirmed strikes or submission. Begin. Zarak-Tel opened with a textbook Krathian power strike, telegraphing his intention from orbit and expecting me to either block or dodge. Instead, I stepped inside his guard using footwork that my old instructor, Master Chun, would have been proud of. My elbow connected with his solar plexus with precisely calculated force. Not enough to seriously injure, but definitely enough to hurt. 1, I said pleasantly, resetting to neutral position. The training hall had gone dead silent. Zarak-Tel stared at me with an expression that suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about human combat capabilities. His second attack came faster, with less telegraphing and more genuine intent. I redirected his momentum using leverage and timing, sweeping his legs out from under him with a technique that was pure judo. He hit the mat hard enough to bounce, and I was already moving to pin position when he rolled away with impressive recovery speed. 2, I announced, though Professor Thane hadn't officially called the strike. Now, Zarak-Tel was angry, which was exactly where I wanted him. Angry opponents made mistakes. They telegraphed, they overcommit, and they provided openings that calm, calculated fighters could exploit with surgical precision. His third attack was all fury and wounded pride, coming at me with everything Krathian physiology could muster. Under normal circumstances, that kind of assault would have overwhelmed most opponents through sheer physical dominance. But I'd trained since age 8 with instructors who'd made sure Earth's military representatives could compete with species that were naturally stronger, faster, or more durable. We learned to use physics instead of muscle, timing instead of speed, and technique instead of relying on physical advantages we didn't possess. I caught his wrist mid-strike, used his momentum against him, and executed a throw that sent 7 feet of frustrated Krathian warriors sailing through the air. He landed on his back with an impact that probably rattled T3 buildings over. Before he could recover, I was on top of him with a joint lock that would dislocate his shoulder if he struggled. Not because I was stronger, I definitely wasn't, but because leverage and proper positioning made strength irrelevant. 3. I said quietly, applying just enough pressure to make the threat clear. Do you submit, or do we continue until something breaks? Zarak-Tel's eyes blazed with humiliation and rage, but he was a warrior first and a proud idiot second. I submit, he ground out through gritted teeth. I released him immediately and offered a hand to help him up. He ignored it, rolling to his feet with wounded dignity and stalking off the mat without looking at anyone. The rest of the class stared at me like I just performed magic tricks instead of basic close-quarters combat. Well, Professor Thane said after a long pause, that was certainly educational. Lieutenant Torres, please explain the methodology you employed. I walked to the center of the training area, very aware that every eye in the class was now focused on the human who just dismantled their academy combat champion. Time to turn this from a personal victory into an actual teaching moment. Earth combat techniques evolved from necessity. I began, keeping my voice level and professional. Humans aren't the strongest species. We're not the fastest or most durable. We don't have natural weapons or enhanced senses. What we have is pattern recognition, adaptability, and several thousand years of developing martial traditions focused on defeating stronger opponents. I gestured to where Zarak-Tel stood nursing his wounded pride and probably bruised ribs. Krathian war forms are excellent for opponents who fight using similar strength-based approaches, but they assume your opponent will engage on those terms. Human martial arts assume the opposite, that we're fighting someone bigger, stronger, and better equipped than we are. So you rely on tricks, a Vexian student called out, her scales rippling with what might have been disdain. We rely on physics. I corrected. Leverage, momentum, balance, and targeting vulnerable points that exist regardless of species. Every being with joints can have those joints manipulated. Every creature that stands on legs can be thrown if you understand the center of gravity. Every opponent who commits to an attack creates openings if you're trained to recognize them. Professor Thane's tentacles had stopped writhing, which meant he was either impressed or calculating how to explain this to his superiors. Demonstrate with a willing volunteer, he instructed. Someone larger than Lieutenant Torres. A massive Thurlock student named Gore stepped forward, probably figuring his 8-foot frame and boulder-like build made him safe from whatever techniques had taken down Zarak-Tel. Poor guy had no idea what he was volunteering for. Attack me however you prefer, I told him. I'll show the class 3 different counters depending on what you choose. Goreth came in with grab, probably intending to use his considerable size advantage to simply overpower me. I sidestepped, caught his arm, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling past me. As he turned confused, I swept his legs, and he went down like a falling tree. Counter 1, I announced. Redirection. Use their momentum and mass against them. Goreth got up more carefully this time, approaching with a strike instead of grab. I blocked, trapped his arm, and executed a throw that put him on the mat again, with me controlling his wrist in a lock that made struggling inadvisable. Counter 2, trapping and control. Limit their options until they're neutralized. The third time, I simply avoided his attack entirely, moving at an angle he couldn't easily follow and tapping strike points on his back that would have been lethal in actual combat. He never even came close to touching me. Counter 3, superior positioning. If you can't be hit, you can't be hurt. By the time Goreth acknowledged defeat, the entire class was watching with the kind of attention usually reserved for advanced weapons theory. Even Zarak-Tel had stopped sulking long enough to observe with grudging interest. Human combat methodology, Professor Thane said slowly, appears to be significantly more sophisticated than initial assessments suggested. Most species assess humans based on our physical limitations, I replied. They see that we're weaker and assume we're less dangerous. That a fundamental misunderstanding of how Earth's warriors approach conflict, which is... I smiled, and this time it wasn't friendly. We don't fight fair. We fight to win. And we've spent thousands of years developing techniques specifically designed to defeat physically superior opponents. You want to understand human combat doctrine? Here it is. The enemy's advantages become irrelevant if you never let them use them. The class erupted in questions, with students suddenly very interested in techniques they dismissed as primitive 30 minutes ago. Professor Thane let them talk for a moment before calling for order. Lieutenant Torres will be conducting supplementary training sessions for any student interested in cross-species combat methodology, he announced. I suspect we'll have full attendance. As the class dispersed, Lyra practically tackled me with a hug that would have been dangerous if I hadn't been braced for it. That was amazing. Did you see Zarak-Tel's face when you threw him? Pretty hard to miss, I admitted, though I'm probably going to pay for embarrassing him in front of everyone. Let him try. You just proved humans can take down opponents twice their size using techniques he's never seen before. She wasn't wrong. But winning one sparring match didn't change the fundamental reality that humans were still considered a minor species in galactic military circles. One demonstration wasn't going to revolutionize how the galaxy viewed Earth's combat capabilities. Or so I thought. What I didn't know was that the entire session had been recorded for the Academy's tactical database. Within 48 hours, footage of a human lieutenant systematically dismantling a Krathian champion using techniques that looked like physics made visible would spread through military channels across 12 different star systems. And people were going to start asking very uncomfortable questions about what else humanity was capable of when properly motivated. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today's victory was simpler. I'd proven that Earth's warriors deserved respect, even if we didn't have natural weapons or enhanced physiology. Sometimes the scariest thing about humans wasn't what we could do. It was what we would do when everyone assumed we couldn't. The training session started small. 3 students the first week, including surprisingly Zarak-Tel, who showed up with an expression that suggested pride was wrestling with curiosity. By week 3, I had 15 regular attendees representing 8 different species, all try to understand how human combat methodology worked. By week 6, the Academy Commandant was sitting in on sessions, taking notes. Explain again why joint manipulation works across species barriers. Commandant Vex requested during a demonstration where I just put a Centauri student into a submission hold that left him tapping frantically. Joint mechanics are universal. I explained, releasing my training partner and helping him up. Doesn't matter if you're human, Krathian, or Thurlock. If you have joints that articulate in specific directions, those joints can be manipulated beyond their natural range of motion. Apply enough pressure in the wrong direction, and biology does the rest. But Centauri physiology includes reinforced skeletal structure specifically designed to resist such attacks, the Commandant pointed out. Reinforced doesn't mean invulnerable. It just means you need to apply pressure more precisely. I gestured to my training partner, who was rubbing his shoulder with grudging respect. I'm not strong enough to force the joint past its tolerance through raw strength, but I don't need to be if I understand leverage points and how to maximize mechanical advantage. The Commandant made more notes, his expression unreadable. Your techniques assume the opponent is physically superior. Always. Better to train for worst-case scenarios and be pleasantly surprised in the reverse. This philosophical approach extends to human military doctrine? I hesitated, because this was veering into territory that made diplomats nervous. Earth's military capabilities were still classified information, shared sparingly with galactic allies who'd spent centuries assuming humanity was too primitive to pose strategic threats. Human military history is extensive. I said carefully, we've been fighting wars since before most species achieved spaceflight. That gives us considerable practical experience in conflict resolution. Conflict resolution, the Commandant repeated with what might have been amusement. Interesting euphemism for organized violence. Diplomacy by other means, sir. That got an actual laugh from a being whose species rarely showed open emotion. I suspect humanity's diplomatic capabilities are more dangerous than most of our allies realize. He wasn't wrong, but acknowledging that truth would raise questions about why Earth kept those capabilities quiet. Better to deflect with a practical demonstration than a theoretical discussion. Sir, if you're interested in human combat methodology, perhaps you'd like to spar? I offered. Nothing teaches like direct experience. The training hall went dead silent. Students froze mid-exercise, staring at me like I just challenged the Academy's supreme authority to single combat. Even Lyra looked concerned, which suggested I'd maybe overstepped protocol by several light years. Commandant Vex studied me with eyes that had seen decades of military service across half the galaxy. Then, slowly, he smiled. Very well, Lieutenant Torres. Let's see if human techniques work against opponents with actual combat experience. Oh no. What had I just volunteered for? The Commandant was Vaxian, which meant enhanced reflexes, natural armor plating, and muscle density that made Krathian physiology look fragile by comparison. He was also a decorated veteran with more combat experience than I had years of life. This was either going to be an excellent teaching moment or a spectacular demonstration of why challenging superior officers to sparring matches was a terrible idea. Possibly both. We took positions on the training mat, and I immediately noticed a difference between fighting Academy students and fighting someone with genuine combat experience. The Commandant's stance was perfect, balanced, ready to move in any direction, with no obvious openings. He wasn't telegraphing intent or making the beginner mistakes that let me dominate earlier opponents. This was going to require actual effort. Standard rules? I asked. No rules, he replied calmly. Show me what human warriors do when rules don't apply. Well, that was either permission to fight seriously or a test to see if I understood appropriate force levels. Given that he was my commanding officer, probably the latter, but he'd said no rules, which meant I could at least make this interesting. I opened with feint, testing his reactions. He didn't bite, just shifted weight fractionally and waited for my real attack. Smart. I tried a different approach, going low and fast, aiming for a leg sweep that would at least force him to react. He stepped over it like I was moving in slow motion. Right. Enhanced reflexes. That eliminated most speed-based techniques from my arsenal. Time to get creative. I changed tactics entirely, shifting from aggressive assault to defensive positioning. If I couldn't outpeed him, I'd make him come to me and work on countering whatever he threw my way. The Commandant's eyes gleamed with what might have been approval as he recognized the strategic shift. His first real attack came without telegraphing, a grab aimed at controlling my arm, and probably ending the match through superior strength. I didn't try to avoid it. Instead, I accepted the grip and used it as an anchor point to execute a throw that should have been impossible given our weight difference. Should have been. Physics and proper technique made it merely difficult. The Commandant hit the mat, but he was already rolling back to his feet before I could capitalize. Fast, experienced, and clearly not impressed by techniques that had worked on Academy students. Interesting, he said. You sacrifice positioning for throws that work against unskilled opponents. But what happens when your opponent knows how to fall? Then I adapt, I replied, already planning my next approach. What followed was the most intense 15 minutes of my life. Every technique I tried, the Commandant countered with experience that came from decades of actual combat. Every opening I thought I saw turned out to be a trap. Every advantage I gained evaporated before I could exploit it. But I also noticed something important. He was testing me, not trying to win quickly, but pushing me to show the full range of human combat methodology. Every time I adapted to one of his counters, he'd introduce a new challenge that forced me to find different solutions. This wasn't a fight. It was an examination. That realization changed everything. If he was testing rather than defeating me, then my objective wasn't winning. It was demonstrating what Earth's warriors could do under pressure. Time to show him something he wouldn't expect. I stopped trying to match his superior physical capabilities and started fighting like what I was, a human who trained to defeat opponents that were bigger, stronger, and faster. That meant using the environment, accepting damage to create openings, and thinking 3 moves ahead instead of reacting to immediate threats. The Commandant's approval was evident even as he countered my increasingly creative attacks. When I finally found an opening and executed a joint lock that would have ended most opponents, he tapped out with an expression that might have been satisfaction. Sufficient, he said, standing and brushing off his uniform. You've proven your point, Lieutenant. Which point would that be, sir? That humanity's combat doctrine is based on assuming every opponent is superior, which paradoxically makes human warriors more dangerous than species that rely on natural advantages. He turned to address the assembled students. Lieutenant Torres represents something most of you have never encountered, a warrior culture that evolved specifically to defeat enemies that should have been unbeatable. Study her techniques, learn from them, and remember that physical superiority means nothing if your opponent refuses to fight on your terms. The class erupted in discussion, with students suddenly very interested in the philosophical implications of combat methodology designed around being the underdog. I stood there feeling like I just opened a door that couldn't be closed, revealing aspect of human capability that Earth had kept quiet for strategic reasons. Commandant Vex noticed my expression. Concerned, Lieutenant? Wondering if I just created diplomatic complications, sir. You created tactical opportunities, he corrected. The Galactic Military has underestimated Earth's warriors for too long. Better for our allies to understand human capabilities through training demonstrations than through battlefield surprises. He had a point, though I suspected Earth's diplomatic corps would prefer we keep the scary effective warrior thing quieter for a while longer. Too late now. The recording crystals had captured everything, and within days, that footage would be circulating through military channels across the galaxy. Humanity's reputation was about to get significantly more dangerous. As students dispersed to practice techniques they just witnessed, Zarak-Tel approached with an expression I couldn't quite read. The Krathian warrior had been attending every session since our initial encounter, learning human methodology with the dedication of someone who'd had their assumptions shattered. Lieutenant Torres, he said formally, I owe you an apology. For what? For assuming Earth's combat techniques were primitive, for mocking traditions I didn't understand, for letting pride blind me to the possibility that smaller species might have developed methodology specifically to defeat larger opponents. I studied him for a moment, looking for any trace of the arrogant warrior who'd volunteered to humiliate me in front of the class. That version of Zarak-Tel seemed to have been replaced by someone who'd learned an important lesson about assumptions and respect. Apology accepted, I said. For what it's worth, Krathian war forms are impressive. They're just designed for different strategic contexts. Fighting opponents of similar size and capability, he agreed, which means they're inadequate for facing enemies who fight like humans. Or they just need adaptation. Your strength and reach are significant advantages if you learn to combine them with techniques that don't rely entirely on power. His eyes brightened with interest. You would teach me? I'd spar with you. I corrected. Learning happens through practice, not instruction. Besides, teaching you Krathian human hybrid techniques would probably create something terrifying. Over the following weeks, that prediction proved accurate. Zarak-Tel's natural physical advantage, combined with human tactical methodology, produced a genuinely frightening fighting style. Other students started requesting similar hybrid training, adapting Earth techniques to their own species' capabilities. What started as one human demonstrating close-quarters combat evolved into something unprecedented, a true cross-species martial exchange that made everyone more dangerous regardless of their natural physiology. The Academy's tactical board took notice. Within 2 months, human combat methodology was added to the core curriculum. Within 6 months, Earth instructors were being requested at military facilities across 3 sectors. Within a year, humanity's warriors had gone from overlooked curiosity to recognized experts in asymmetric combat doctrine, all because one Krathian warrior made the mistake of mocking techniques he didn't understand, and one human lieutenant quietly demonstrated why that was a terrible idea. Years later, when historians analyze humanity's rise from minor species to respected military power, they'd point to battles and diplomatic achievements as turning points. But those of us who were there knew the truth. Sometimes the most important victories aren't won with fleets and armies. Sometimes they're won on training mats, one humble opponent at a time, by warriors who prove that physical advantages mean nothing against properly applied technique and a few thousand years of practiced violence. Zarak-Tel never mocked Earth's combat methods again. Neither did anyone else who'd witnessed what human warriors could do when we stopped pretending to be harmless, and that, more than any battle or treaty, was how humanity earned its place among the galaxy's warrior cultures. One dislocated shoulder and bruised ego at a time. Subscribe and like to my channel for more sci-fi stories.